The wind out here did not just blow, it hunted. It moved across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory like a living thing, seeking out the gaps in a man's coat and the cracks in his resolve. Elias Boone pulled his hat brim lower, squinting against the stinging grit that rode the gusts. He was 35 years old, though the land had carved lines into his face that made him look 10 years older. He sat atop his dun gelding, a sturdy animal named Rusty, and watched the fence line that marked the northern edge of his property. It was late November, the time of year when the sky turned the color of bruised iron and the ground froze hard enough to ring like an anvil under a hoof. The wire fence hummed in the gale, a lonely, metallic song that was the only music Elias had heard for months. He was a man built of hard angles and silence. His shoulders were broad from years of throwing hay and wrestling calves, but he carried himself with a quiet, watchful tension. A jagged white scar ran along the line of his jaw on the left side, a souvenir from a saloon fight in Kansas nearly a decade ago. That fight had ended with a man dead on the sawdust floor and Elias riding north, carrying a weight in his gut that no amount of whiskey or distance could dissolve. Since then, he had kept to himself, building a small cattle spread in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, speaking only when necessary, which was rare, but today, the silence felt different. It felt heavy with expectation. Elias reached into the breast pocket of his sheepskin coat. His gloved fingers brushed against the thick, folded paper there, ensuring it was still safe. It was a letter, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and read 100 times by the light of a kerosene lamp. The handwriting was neat, looping, and feminine. Margaret Hale, Maggie. He had placed the advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper 6 months ago, feeling like a fool the entire time he sat in the newspaper office, dictating his simple request: rancher, solitary life, seeking honest wife for partnership and home, respect guaranteed. He had expected silence, or perhaps scorn. Instead, he had received a letter from a seamstress in Chicago. She wrote that she was 28 years old, accustomed to hard work, and seeking a fresh start away from the city smoke and noise. She called herself no one special, a phrase that had tugged at something deep in Elias's chest. Today was the day. He turned Rusty's head away from the wire and toward the distant smudge of gray that marked the town of Bitter Creek. "You are a fool, Elias," he told himself, the thought echoing the rhythm of the horse's gait. A woman like that taking a chance on a man with a scarred face and a dirt floor cabin. She will take one look at you and get back on the stage. But the hope was a stubborn weed. He had scrubbed the cabin floor until his knuckles were raw. He had fixed the leak in the roof. He had even shaved that morning, the razor scraping over the scar, leaving his skin raw and stinging in the cold air. The ride to Bitter Creek took 3 hours. The town was little more than 2 rows of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of a muddy thoroughfare, huddled against the vastness of the plains as if afraid of being swallowed whole. As Elias rode in, the smell of wood smoke and wet pine greeted him. A few horses stood hipshot at the hitching rails, tails flicking against the wind. He tied Rusty outside the livery and walked to the stage depot. The station master, a balding man named Silas who chewed tobacco as if he were angry at it, gave Elias a nod. "She is due in 10 minutes, Silas said, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dust. "You look like you are going to a funeral. Boone, fix your face. I am just waiting," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. He stood on the boardwalk, the wind whipping his duster around his legs. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that shamed him. He checked his pocket watch. 2 o'clock. At 10 minutes past 2. The sound of thundering hooves and the creak of leather springs announced the stagecoach. It rolled into town, a layer of road dust coating its red paint, the 6 horses lathered and blowing steam in the frigid air. The driver hauled back on the reins, the brake lever groaning as the heavy vehicle lurched to a halt in front of the station. Elias took a step forward, his hands sweating inside his leather gloves. The door swung open. A man in a bowler hat stepped out, carrying a heavy valise, then an older woman with a sour expression, clutching a Bible. then a salesman with a sample case. Elias waited. He watched the dark interior of the coach, expecting a hand to reach out, a skirt to brush the step. The driver jumped down and began unstrapping luggage from the boot. The passengers dispersed, heading for the hotel or the saloon. The door of the coach remained open, swinging slightly in the wind, revealing only empty leather seats. She was not there. Elias stood frozen. The noise of the town seemed to fade, replaced by a high, ringing silence in his ears. He felt a profound, sinking sensation, as if the boardwalk had suddenly turned to water beneath his boots. He walked over to the driver, a man named Holloway, who was dusting off his coat. "Was there another passenger?" Elias asked. His voice sounded calm, which surprised him. "A woman. Margaret Hale, from Chicago." Holloway shook his head, not looking up. "That is the lot of them. Boone picked them up in Cheyenne. Nobody else." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He stepped back, his hand going instinctively to his pocket, touching the letter. Of course she had not come. Why would she? She had likely taken the ticket money he sent and used it to move somewhere else. Or perhaps she had met someone in St. Louis, someone without a scar and a remote, lonely ranch. Or maybe she had simply come to her senses. He felt a hot flush of humiliation rise up his neck. He had told Silas. He had told the owner of the general store that he was expecting a wife. They would all know. They would look at him with that pity that was worse than scorn. The Boone fellow, thinking he could buy happiness, thinking he was fit for decent company. He turned and walked away before Holloway could see the look in his eyes. He needed a drink. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. Elias ordered a whiskey and took it to a table in the back, sitting with his back to the wall. He drank the burning liquid in one swallow and stared at the empty glass. The memory of the man he killed in Kansas flickered in his mind. The sudden flash of the knife, the reflex of his own gun, the look of surprise on the boy's face as he fell. It was an accident of survival, but the guilt had never left him. He had thought, foolishly, that perhaps he had served his penance, that perhaps Maggie Hale was his chance to be something other than a killer and a recluse. "You deserve this," he thought bitterly. "You are alone because that is what you are meant to be." At the bar, two freight haulers were talking to an old scout named Jim Bridger, not the famous one, but a weathered old man who claimed to be his cousin. They were speaking in low, serious tones, but the saloon was quiet enough that their words drifted back to Elias. "I tell you, it was a mess." The freighter was saying, "We passed the wreckage about 20 miles east of the cut. Wagons turned over, trunks smashed. Looked like a devil of a storm caught them, or maybe road agents, though I did not see any bullet holes." Bridger shook his head, his long gray hair swaying. "It is the pass. The wind comes down off the granite peak like a hammer. If they tried to cross 3 days ago when that squall hit, they never stood a chance." "Did you stop?" the bartender asked, wiping a glass. "We looked," the freighter said. "Saw a couple of bodies frozen stiff. Looked like they had been there 2 days. We did not have shovels to bury them, and the ground is like iron. We brought the mail pouch, though, found it near the lead wagon." Elias felt a cold prickle at the base of his spine. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He walked over to the bar. "What wagon train?" Elias asked. The freighter turned, eyeing Elias warily. "Small outfit. 3 wagons, coming up from the southern spur, trying to beat the snow to the settlement." Elias looked at the mail pouch sitting on the bar. The station master must have left it there for sorting. It was unbuckled. "Who was on it?" Elias asked. The freighter shrugged. "A family named Jensen, a couple of drovers, and a woman traveling alone. I saw the manifest in the pocket of the trail boss." Elias reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled the manifest from the pouch. It was a crumpled piece of paper, stained with coffee and dirt. He scanned the list of names. Jensen, O'Malley, Kincaid, and there, near the bottom, M. Hale. Destination, Bitter Creek. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The glass in his hand would have shattered if he were holding one. His stomach dropped. a sensation like falling from a great height. She had not abandoned him. She had not taken his money and laughed. She had come. She had been out there, on the trail, coming to him. "She is dead," the freighter said matter-of-factly, seeing Elias's face. "Nobody survives 2 nights out there in the open. Not with the temperature dropping like this." Elias looked up. The panic that had been a quiet hum in his chest roared into a deafening noise. "Where?" he demanded. "Where exactly?" "East of the Skeleton Ridge," the freighter said, "near the dry creek bed that runs into the Powder. But listen, friend, you do not want to go out there. The wolves will be at them by now. And there is another storm rolling in tonight. You can see the clouds banking up over the peaks." "I have to go," Elias said. Jim Bridger grabbed his arm. His grip was like tangled wire. "Son, do not be a fool. If there were survivors, they are gone now, frozen or eaten. You ride out there now, and we will be thawing 2 bodies out come spring instead of 1. Elias looked at the old man's hand, then into his watery blue eyes. He saw the truth there. The land was indifferent. It ate the weak and the unlucky, and it did not give them back. But then he thought of the letter in his pocket. "I am no one special." He thought of her riding across half the country to meet a man she knew only by his jagged handwriting. She had come for him, and he was sitting here drinking whiskey while she was out there in the ice. He pulled his arm free. "I am going." The bartender slammed a glass down. "You are suicide-bound." "Boone!" Elias did not answer. He pushed through the bat-wing doors and into the street. The wind hit him instantly, colder now, smelling of coming snow. He went to the general store first. He bought extra cartridges for his Winchester rifle, a heavy wool blanket, a flask of brandy, and 5 pounds of jerked beef. He bought a coil of hemp rope and a lantern with extra oil. He moved with a mechanical efficiency, shutting down the part of his mind that screamed he was too late. He had to be moving. If he stopped moving, the grief would catch him. He mounted Rusty and turned the horse east, away from the ranch, away from safety, and toward the open, featureless plains. The town faded behind him, swallowed by the gray light. The landscape here was a study in desolation. The ground was frozen hardpan, tufted with brittle sagebrush that rattled in the wind. To the west, the mountains were jagged purple teeth biting into the sky. To the east, the plains rolled on forever, brown and empty. Elias rode hard. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against him. His fingers ached on the reins, the leather stiff with cold. He kept his eyes on the ground, looking for the ruts of the wagon trail, which were barely visible under the dusting of old snow. He hesitated only once. He pulled Rusty to a halt and took the letter out of his pocket. He did not read it. The wind would have torn it from his hands. He just held it for a second, feeling the paper through his glove. He felt a surprising tenderness, a fierce, protective warmth that defied the cold. He had never seen her face, but she belonged to him, and he belonged to her. It was a contract made in ink and hope, and he would not break it. He tucked the letter away and kicked the horse forward. Hours passed. The sky darkened, turning from gray to a bruised charcoal. The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung his face like sand. He began to see the debris before he saw the wagons. First, it was a wooden crate, smashed open, revealing tins of peaches scattered in the sagebrush. Then, a mile later, he saw something fluttering on a bush. He rode closer and leaned down. It was a woman's glove, fine kid leather, dark blue, with pearl buttons. It was delicate, completely unsuited for this country. It looked like a severed hand caught in the thorns. Elias stared at it, his throat tight. He imagined a hand inside it, small, capable, perhaps trembling with cold. He imagined her losing it as the wagon tipped, or maybe dropping it as she tried to crawl to safety. Fury rose in him. It was a hot, blinding rage directed at everything and nothing. At the storm, at the wagon master for risking the pass, at the God that would let a woman travel 2,000 miles only to die alone in a ditch. He stuffed the glove into his pocket. Next to the letter, "We are close. Rusty," he said to the horse. The wind tore the words away. Snow began to fall. It did not drift down gently. It came sideways. Driven by the gale, it streaked the horizon in gray curtains, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The temperature plummeted. Elias could feel the cold seeping through his sheepskin coat, settling into his bones. He knew the danger. If he lost the trail now, he could ride in circles until he froze. The smart thing to do was to find a depression in the ground, huddle with the horse under a blanket, and wait for morning. But he could not stop. The image of that glove drove him on. Just as the last of the light was bleeding out of the sky, the storm broke for a moment. The clouds parted enough to let a strange, luminous twilight bathe the plains, and there he saw it. About half a mile ahead, the land dipped into a shallow ravine, likely a dry creek bed. In the bottom of the cut, dark shapes lay scattered like broken toys. Elias urged the tired horse into a gallop. He rode down the slope, the hooves skidding on the icy rocks. The wreckage was a graveyard of ambition. 3 wagons lay in various states of destruction. One was tipped onto its side, the canvas cover shredded and flapping like a surrender flag. Another was smashed completely. Its contents spewed across the frozen mud: clothing, books, pots, a broken rocking chair. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard, though he knew there were no bandits here. The only enemy here was the cold. He walked toward the lead wagon. He saw the first body. It was a man, lying face down, half buried in a drift. His coat was frozen solid. Elias walked past him. He could not help the dead. "Maggie!" he shouted. The wind swallowed his voice. "Margaret!" He moved through the debris, scanning the ground. He checked inside the tipped wagon. Empty, save for a dead dog curled in the corner. He felt a crushing weight of despair. She was gone. She was buried under the snow somewhere, or she had tried to walk for help and died miles away on the open plain. He circled the last wagon. It had lost a wheel and collapsed heavily onto a large steamer trunk that had been thrown clear. And then he saw a patch of blue. It was the same color as the glove. He ran forward, dropping his rifle. She was there, huddled in the lee of the broken wagon bed, partially pinned beneath a heavy wooden trunk that had slid off the top. She was curled into a ball, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was wearing a blue traveling coat that was torn at the shoulder. Her hat was gone, and her dark hair was loose, matted with ice and dried blood where she had struck her temple. "Maggie," Elias choked out. He fell to his knees beside her. He touched her face. Her skin was terrifyingly cold, like marble. Her lips were blue, cracked and still. He ripped his gloves off and pressed his fingers to her neck. He held his breath, waiting. There, a faint, thready flutter against his fingertips. A heartbeat. "She is alive." Elias felt a sob break in his chest, but he choked it down. He grabbed the heavy trunk that was pinning her legs. He gritted his teeth and heaved, the muscles in his back straining. The trunk slid back with a scrape of wood on rock. He gently pulled her free. She was limp, a rag doll in his arms. He pulled her onto his lap, shielding her body with his own against the wind. "Margaret," he said, shaking her gently. "Maggie, wake up." Her eyelids fluttered. They were heavy, crusted with snow. She opened them a slit. Her eyes were dark, unfocused, glassy with hypothermia. She looked through him, seeing things that weren't there. "The train," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. "I missed the train." "No," Elias said, unbuttoning his sheepskin coat. "You are safe. I have you, Elias." She breathed. He froze. She knew his name. She had been lying here, freezing to death, thinking of the man she was coming to marry. "I am here," he said. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping the edges of his thick coat around her, trying to share his body heat. "I am Elias. I found you." She did not answer. Her eyes drifted shut again, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Elias looked up at the sky. The hole in the clouds was closing. The snow was coming back, heavier this time. Night had fully fallen. He could not stay here. If they stayed, they would both die. But riding back in the dark, in a blizzard, with an unconscious woman was madness. He looked at Maggie's face. It was pale and bruised, but strong. She had survived 2 days. She had held on. He stood up, lifting her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, bird-boned and fragile. He carried her to Rusty. "Easy, boy," he murmured to the horse. He managed to get her into the saddle, holding her steady with one hand while he swung up behind her. He settled her in front of him, wrapping his heavy wool blanket around both of them, cocooning her against his chest. He took the rope from his saddlebag and tied it loosely around her waist and his own, binding them together so she would not fall if she passed out completely. He turned the horse's head back toward the west, into the teeth of the wind. "Let's go home," he said. The journey back was a blur of agony and endurance. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the white swirl of snow. Elias could not see the trail. He had to trust the horse's instinct and his own internal compass. Every jolt of the horse seemed to rattle Maggie's bones. Every few minutes, she would whimper or gasp, a sound of pain that cut through Elias like a knife. "Stay with me," he murmured into her ear, his lips brushing her icy hair. "Do not sleep. Maggie, you hear me? We have warm coffee at the cabin. I have a fire laid. You just have to hold on." He told her about the ranch. He talked to keep her awake, to keep himself awake. He told her about the creek in the spring, about the way the light hit the barn in the morning. He told her about the calf that had been born last week. She drifted in and out. Once, she thrashed against the rope, crying out about the cold. "I know," he soothed, tightening his arm around her. "I know it hurts, but you are not alone. I have you. I will not let you go." The wind howled, a banshee scream that tried to drown him out. His hands were numb blocks of wood on the reins. His feet had lost all feeling, but he burned with a singular purpose. He felt the faint rise and fall of her chest against his own rib cage. It was the only thing in the world that mattered. He had spent 10 years pushing people away, terrified of the violence in his own hands. Now, those same hands were the only thing keeping this stranger alive. He drove his heels into the horse's flanks. He would fight the storm. He would fight the cold. He would fight death itself if it tried to take her now. "We are coming home. Maggie," he whispered into the dark. "Just hold on." They rode on into the black, white-flecked void. 2 small sparks of life in a world of ice, bound together by a rope and a desperate promise. The darkness that draped the Wyoming territory was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the man and the horse. Elias Boone could no longer feel his hands. They were frozen claws wrapped around the reins, guiding Rusty through the drifts by muscle memory alone. The wind had ceased its screaming and settled into a low, mournful moan that vibrated through the timber of the cabin walls as they finally emerged from the swirling white. The cabin was a dark square against the lighter gray of the snow. It looked impossibly small, a fragile box of timber set against a universe of ice. Elias slid from the saddle, his legs folded under him for a second, numb and stiff, before he caught himself against the horse's flank. He waited for the blood to rush back into his limbs, a prickling agony that told him he was still alive. He reached up and untied the rope that bound Maggie to his waist. She was limp, a dead weight in the cocoon of blankets. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He pulled her down into his arms. She felt terrifyingly small. In the vastness of the plains, amidst the wreckage of the wagons, she had been a tragedy. Now, in his arms, she was a woman, fragile, breakable, and entirely dependent on him. He stumbled toward the door, kicking the piled snow away with his boots, and shouldered his way inside. The air in the cabin was stagnant and frigid, only a few degrees warmer than the outside. Elias carried her to the narrow bed in the corner, laying her down on the buffalo robe. He did not light the lamp yet. First, the fire. He moved to the cast-iron stove with clumsy, fumbling urgency. His fingers were so stiff, he dropped the lucifer match twice before he managed to strike it against the iron. The flame flared, blue and orange, and he fed it kindling, then larger logs, blowing on the embers until the stove began to roar and tick with expanding heat. Only then did he light the kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light washed over the room, revealing Maggie's face. She was pale as milk, her lips possessing a violet hue that made his stomach turn. Her breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the quiet room. She was soaking wet. The snow had melted against her clothes during the ride, and the hem of her dress was frozen stiff with mud and ice. Elias stood over her, his hands hovering. He was a bachelor who had lived alone for 10 years. The only women he spoke to were the wives of other ranchers at church or the store clerk in town. He had never seen a woman in her underthings, let alone undressed one. But if he left her in these wet clothes, she would die of lung fever before sunrise. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered to the unconscious woman. He began to work, his movements practical and swift, though his ears burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. He unbuttoned her heavy traveling coat, peeling the sodden wool away from her arms. Underneath, her dress was a dark serge, torn at the shoulder and muddy at the hem. He turned his head away as he unhooked the back of the bodice, fixing his eyes on the rough-hewn logs of the wall. He worked by touch, his calloused fingertips struggling with the tiny, delicate hooks. When the dress was loose, he pulled it down, sliding it over her hips and legs. He left her in her chemise and petticoats. Though they were damp, he could not bring himself to go further. He grabbed every quilt he owned, a patchwork one his mother had made, 2 heavy wool blankets from the Hudson's Bay Company, and piled them over her. He took off his own flannel shirt, which was dry and warm from his saddlebag, and managed to maneuver her arms into it over her chemise, buttoning it to her chin. As he worked, he saw the bruises. They bloomed like dark violets across her ribs and along her upper arm. There was a nasty gash on her temple, clotted with dried blood. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, wiping sweat from his forehead. The cabin was warming up, the smell of wood smoke replacing the scent of ice and wet wool. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, watching her chest rise and fall. He did not sleep. He simply watched, acting as a sentry against the death that had tried to claim her. Maggie floated in a dark, cold river. Sometimes she heard voices, shouting, the scream of horses, and sometimes she heard only the wind. Then, the river changed. It became warm. There was a smell of pine and coffee. She opened her eyes. Above her, she saw rough timber beams, stained with soot. This was not the wagon. This was not the boarding house in Chicago. She turned her head. A man was sitting in a chair, his head bowed, asleep. He was large, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled over his collar. Panic seized her. The last thing she remembered clearly was the wagon tipping, the world spinning. Had she been taken? There were stories of women snatched from the trail, sold or used. She tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her ribs. Sharp and breathless, a small cry escaped her lips. The man's head snapped up instantly. His eyes were dark and alert. He leaned forward, his big hands coming up as if to calm a startled horse. "Easy," he said. His voice was deep, rough like gravel, but quiet. "You are safe." "Who are you?" she rasped. Her throat felt like it was full of glass. "Where am I?" "I am Elias," he said. "Elias Boone." The name floated in the air between them. Elias, the man from the letters, the handwriting. "You never came," he said gently. "The stage arrived, but you were not on it. I went looking." Maggie stared at him, trying to align the image of this rugged, scarred man with the polite, distant words on the paper. "You found me, in the wreck," he said. "You were pinned. I brought you home. Home." The words sounded strange. She looked around the cabin. It was small, tidy, and masculine. A rifle hung over the door. A saddle sat in the corner. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt, huge and enveloping. Her face flushed hot. "My clothes," she whispered, clutching the quilt to her chin. "They were wet," Elias said quickly, looking toward the fire. "I had to get you warm. I turned my head. Ma'am, I promise you." She saw the red creep up his neck, past the white line of his collar. He was embarrassed. This man, who looked like he could wrestle a steer to the ground, was blushing because he had seen her in her petticoats. The fear in her chest uncoiled. "Just a fraction, thank you," she said. "Rest now," Elias said, standing up. "You are safe here. The door is barred. The fire is built. Nothing can get to you." The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain and healing. The blizzard raged outside, sealing the cabin in a tomb of white. But inside, it was a small island of fragile safety. Elias became her nurse. It was a strange role for a man with hands the size of shovels, but he was surprisingly gentle. He boiled water on the stove, the steam filling the small room. He tore up an old clean sheet to make bandages. She watched him through half-closed eyes as he cleaned the gash on her temple. His brow was furrowed in intense concentration. His breath held tight in his chest. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort of being soft. "Is it bad?" she asked one evening, as he applied a poultice of herbs to her bruised shoulder. "It will heal," he said. "You will have a scar, maybe, but you are mending." He slept on a bedroll near the fire, giving her the only bed. At night, she would hear the wind howling like a lost soul, tearing at the corners of the cabin. Far off, coyotes yipped and sang, a lonely, chilling sound that made her pull the quilts tighter. But then she would hear the stove tick as the metal cooled, or the soft rasp of Elias turning over in his sleep, and the terror of the wilderness would recede. They spoke little at first. The silence of the high plains seemed to have seeped into the cabin. But as her strength returned, the silence began to fill with halting words. She lay propped up on pillows he had fashioned from grain sacks, watching him mend a bridle by the light of the lamp. "Why did you choose me?" she asked suddenly. Elias looked up, the needle pausing in the leather. "Ma'am?" "My letter," she said. "It was short. I said I had no skills for ranching. I said I was plain." "Why did you answer?" Elias set the bridle down. He looked at his hands. "You said you wanted a fresh start. You said you were tired of noise. I reckoned I understood that." Maggie picked at the edge of the quilt. "I was a seamstress," she said. "In Chicago, I worked in a room with 20 other women. No windows, just gaslight and dust." She paused, the memory tasting of soot and shame. "I lived alone in a boarding house." She continued, "A woman living alone. People talk. They assume things. My landlord, he was a man named Mr. Caro. He thought because I had no father or husband, I was available." Elias went very still. His eyes were fixed on her face, dark and unreadable. "He tried to force his way into my room one night," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I fought him off with a pair of fabric shears. I cut his arm. He told everyone I was a madwoman. He told my employer I was a thief and a harlot. I lost my position." She looked up at Elias, her chin trembling. "I did not come here for adventure, Mr. Boone. I came because there was nowhere else to go, no one who would stand between me and the world. I sold everything I had for the train ticket." Elias looked at her for a long time. She expected judgment. She expected him to ask if she had encouraged the man, as the police officer in Chicago had. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You are safe here." "Maggie," he said. His use of her given name was unconscious, a slip. "If any man tries to force a door here, he will answer to me, and I do not miss." She saw the steel in his eyes then, a glimpse of something dangerous that lived beneath his quiet surface. It should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel a fierce, warm gratitude that started in her chest and spread to her toes. He did not offer his own story that night. He turned back to the bridle, pulling the thread tight with a snap. But she saw the way his jaw worked, the way the scar stood out white against his skin. As the second week passed, the cabin began to feel smaller, or perhaps they were just filling it more. Maggie was well enough to sit at the table now. She wore her mended dress, which Elias had clumsily tried to wash for her. They ate stew made from dried beef and potatoes, sitting across from each other in the pool of lantern light. She began to notice things. She watched his hands as he broke bread. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen from work, but they moved with a deliberate grace. She noticed the way he checked the window every 10 minutes, a habit born of a man who lived with danger. Elias, in turn, watched her. He noticed the way her dark hair, which she tried to braid neatly, would always escape in tendrils that curled around her ears. He noticed the way she pressed her lips together into a thin line when her ribs ached, refusing to complain. He noticed that she smelled of the lavender soap he had bought in town, a scent that seemed impossibly delicate in this rough room. The isolation forced a physical closeness that was both natural and electric. When he passed her a tin cup of coffee, his fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, a mere graze of skin, but it sent a jolt through him that made him almost drop the cup. He saw her eyes widen slightly, her breath hitch. They were a man and a woman, strangers and yet not, trapped in a box while winter tried to bury them. The air between them grew thick with things unsaid. One night, the wind rose to a shriek. The cabin groaned under the assault. Suddenly, a violent gust caught the leather hinges of the shutter on the south window. With a crack like a pistol shot, the shutter flew open, banging against the outer wall. Snow exploded into the room, swirling in the lamplight. "The shutter!" Elias yelled. Leaping from his chair, he rushed to the window, struggling to pull the heavy wooden board back against the gale. The wind was incredibly strong. It pushed back against him, coating his face in ice instantly. Maggie was there beside him in a second. She ignored the pain in her side, grabbing the edge of the shutter and pulling with him. Together, Elias roared over the wind. 1, 2, pull! They heaved. The shutter slammed shut. Elias threw the latch, locking it down. They spun away from the window, gasping for breath, the snow melting on their faces. They were standing in the narrow space between the table and the wall, pressed shoulder to shoulder. The adrenaline was still humming in their blood. Elias looked down at her. Her hair had come loose from its pins, tumbling over her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and the exertion. Her eyes were bright and wild. He was acutely aware of the heat of her body radiating through her dress. He could smell the lavender in the cold air and the scent of her skin. They stood there, breaths mingling in white puffs in the chilly room. The moment stretched. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to reach out, to span the 3 inches between them and pull her against him. The hunger to do so was a physical ache in his gut, sharp and demanding. He saw her gaze drop to his mouth, then flick back up to his eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and longing. Then Maggie stepped back. She bumped into the table, jarring the lamp. "I am sorry," she stammered, putting a hand to her messy hair. I should have pinned this better." She turned away, her face burning. "I know why you sent for a bride. Elias, I know a man out here needs things, but I am not sure I am what you wanted. I am broken. I am trouble." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He saw the shame in the set of her shoulders. She thought she was a disappointment. She thought she was a transaction that had turned out to be a poor investment. He reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was firm but gentle. "Maggie, look at me." She turned slowly, refusing to meet his eyes. He stepped closer, his voice rough with an emotion he did not know how to name. "Do not ever say that. Do not ever think I look at you and see a debt paid." He struggled for the words. He was a man of silence, and language felt clumsy in his mouth. "I did not send for a worker," he said, "and I did not send for a warmer for my bed. I sent because the silence out here gets so loud it drowns a man. I wanted someone who chose to be here, not someone I bought." His voice cracked on the last word. He felt exposed, stripped of his armor. He was admitting that he was lonely, that he was human. Maggie looked up then. She saw the vulnerability in his face, the raw honesty in his dark eyes. She saw that he was just as afraid as she was, afraid of being rejected, afraid of being alone. "You chose me," she whispered. "You came into the storm for me. I would do it again," he said. Tonight, the air in the room seemed to shift. The tension of the storm outside faded, replaced by a warm, heavy silence. It was not the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down together. After that night, the walls of the cabin seemed to expand. There was room for both of them now. They talked more freely. Maggie asked about the cattle, about the seasons. She wanted to know how he survived the winters before. Elias found himself speaking words he had kept locked away for years. He told her about the long months where the snow drifted to the eaves. He told her about the time he broke his leg and had to crawl to the creek for water. And then, one evening while the fire crackled low, he told her the rest. "I am not a good man, Maggie," he said, staring into the flames. She looked up from her mending. "You saved my life." "I took a life," he said. The silence that followed was heavy. He waited for her to gasp, to pull away. "It was 10 years ago. In Kansas," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A saloon fight. A boy, barely 20. He pulled a knife. I was faster. I did not mean to kill him. But the gun, it went off. He touched the scar on his jaw. His brother gave me this before I got out. He swore he would hunt me down. I get letters, sometimes, posted from different towns, telling me he is coming. That is why I live out here. That is why I have no neighbors." He looked at her then, expecting to see revulsion. He saw only a deep, sorrowful understanding. "He attacked you," she stated softly. "It does not change that he is dead," Elias said. "No," she agreed. "It does not, but it does not make you a monster. Elias, it makes you a man carrying a heavy stone." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm, her fingers small against his scarred knuckles. "We all have ghosts," she said. "I have mine. You have yours. Maybe they can haunt each other and leave us be." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, a knot that had been pulled tight for a decade. He turned his hand over and squeezed her fingers. The winter refused to yield. The nights grew colder, the frost patterning the inside of the window glass in fern-like shapes. One night, the darkness of the cabin was shattered by a cry. "Elias!" He was awake in an instant, throwing off his blankets and crossing the room in 2 strides. Maggie was sitting up in bed, gasping, her hands clawing at the quilt. She was trembling violently. "I am here," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. She turned to him, her eyes wide and unseeing. "The trunk, the weight. I can't breathe." It was a nightmare of the wreck. He had seen it before, but never this bad. He reached out and took her by the shoulders. "Maggie, you are in the cabin. Look at the fire. Look at me." She blinked, the terror slowly receding as she focused on his face. She let out a sob and launched herself forward, burying her face in his chest. She clung to him with a desperate strength, her fingers digging into his shirt. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Elias froze for a heartbeat. He could feel every curve of her body against him, the softness of her through the thin cotton of her night rail. Her hair smelled of sleep and lavender. His arms came around her instinctively, holding her close. He pressed his cheek to the top of her head. "It is gone," he murmured, rubbing her back in slow, soothing circles. "The storm is gone." He could feel her heart hammering against his own ribs. The rhythm of it matched his own. The comfort shifted, subtle and dangerous. He became aware of the heat of her skin. He became aware that they were on a bed, in the dark, and she was in his arms. He wanted to pull her closer. He wanted to slide his hands into her hair, to tilt her face up and kiss the fear away. He wanted to wrap himself around her and keep the cold out forever. The desire was a sudden, roaring fire in his blood. He felt her breath hitch against his neck. She had gone still. She wasn't pulling away. For a second, the world narrowed down to the sound of their breathing and the warmth where their bodies touched. But then he remembered the fear in her eyes when she talked about the man in Chicago. He remembered her saying she had nowhere else to go. If he touched her now, if he took what he wanted, he would be just like them. He would be another man taking advantage of her desperation. He forced himself to loosen his grip. He took a steadying breath, fighting the urge to stay. "You should sleep," he said. his voice strained and hoarse. "The sun will be up soon." He felt her hesitate. She pulled back slowly, her hands lingering on his chest for a fraction of a second too long before dropping to her lap. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and searching in the gloom. "Stay?" she whispered. "Just until I fall asleep?" Elias swallowed hard. He nodded. He sat there on the edge of the bed, his back stiff, holding her hand while she lay back down. He watched the firelight dance on the walls, listening to her breathing even out. He did not sleep that night. He sat guard over her dreams and over his own treacherous heart. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the window, the cabin felt different. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim. They were two damaged people, their scars visible to one another, bound by a fragile trust that was slowly, terrifiedly, turning into something else. Outside, the wilderness was still a killer, but inside, the air was thick with a simmering, unspoken heat that was more dangerous and more promising than any storm. The thaw began slowly, a reluctant concession from the winter that held the Wyoming territory in its teeth. Inside the cabin, Maggie Hale moved with a quiet, deliberate determination. Her ribs still ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm every time she lifted the heavy cast-iron skillet, and the scar on her temple was a fresh, angry pink line against her pale skin. But she was standing. She stood at the rough-hewn table, a paring knife in her hand, peeling potatoes that Elias had brought up from the root cellar, the skins curled away in long, brown ribbons, revealing the white flesh underneath. It was a simple task. A task she had done 1,000 times in the boarding house kitchen back in Chicago, usually while dodging the sharp tongue of the landlady. But here, in this drafty cabin with the wind whistling through the chinking, it felt like a sacrament. She was alive, she was warm, and she was useful. Elias was outside, chopping wood. The rhythmic thwack-crack of the axe-splitting pine logs was a steady heartbeat that anchored her. She finished the potatoes and moved to the pile of mending on the chair. She picked up one of Elias's flannel shirts, the elbows worn almost through. As she threaded the needle, a strange feeling washed over her. It was a tightness in her chest, but not from pain. It was a sense of belonging that terrified her. She looked around the room, the fire snapping in the stove, the sunlight stretching across the floorboards, the smell of coffee and sawdust. It was a life she had read about in penny novels but never believed she deserved. She was Maggie the seamstress, the woman who lived in the shadows, the woman who had to sew her own way out of trouble. The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the man himself. Elias stomped the snow from his boots, his breath clouding in the entryway. He carried an armful of split wood, which he stacked neatly by the stove. He straightened up, brushing bark from his sleeves. He looked at her, his dark eyes taking in the mended shirt in her lap. "You should be resting," he said. His voice was rough, but the edge of it was soft. "I have rested enough," Maggie replied, not looking up from her stitching. "My hands need to work. Elias, if they stop, I start to think, and I do not want to think today." Elias watched her for a moment longer, then nodded. He moved to the wash basin, scrubbing the pitch from his hands. "I have to go into town," he said. Maggie's hand froze. The needle pricked her finger, a tiny bead of blood swelling on the tip. She looked up, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "Town?" she repeated. "We are low on flour," Elias said, drying his hands on a rag, "and coffee, and I need to see if the depot has word on the rest of the salvage." He meant the wreck. He meant the dead. Maggie set the shirt down. She felt a sudden, cold void open up beside her. For 3 weeks, Elias had been her entire world. He was the wall between her and the wilderness. "You will be back?" she asked. The question was small and pathetic, and she hated herself for asking it. Elias paused in the act of putting on his coat. He looked at her, his expression serious. "I will be back before sundown. He promised I would not leave you otherwise." He checked the rifle above the door, then turned to her. "Bar the door behind me, Maggie. Open it for no one but me." When he rode out 10 minutes later, Maggie watched from the window until he and Rusty were just a dark speck against the white expanse of the plains. Then she slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The silence of the cabin, usually a comfort, suddenly felt heavy. It pressed against her ears, without the sound of his breathing or the scrape of his boots. The ghosts began to creep out of the corners. She remembered the cold of the wreck. She remembered the feeling of being trapped. And deeper, older ghosts surfaced. The fear that this was all a trick, that the men from her past, the ones who saw a woman alone as prey, would find her here. She sat in the chair, clutching the mended shirt to her chest, and waited. Bitter Creek was an ugly scar of mud and timber on the face of the prairie. The snow had melted into a thick, churned slush in the main street, sucking at the hooves of Elias's horse as he rode in. He felt the eyes on him immediately. It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone's business. And what they did not know, they invented. Elias Boone, the recluse rancher, had ridden out into a blizzard to find a dead woman and had come back with a live one. That was the story. He tied Rusty at the rail in front of the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk. Two men were leaning against the wall, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. One was a ranch hand from the Double Bar outfit. The other was the town blacksmith. "Afternoon. Boone," the blacksmith said. He did not smile. "Heard you got company out at your place." Elias touched the brim of his hat. "Just buying supplies. Miller." The ranch hand smirked. "Must be some woman to survive that storm. Or maybe she just knew how to keep warm." "Hey." Elias stopped. He turned slowly to face the man. He did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for the Colt on his hip, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She survived because she has more grit in her little finger than you have in your whole carcass," Elias said softly. "Be careful with your words, son. The wind carries them." The ranch hand swallowed hard and looked away, flicking his cigarette into the mud. Elias turned and entered the store. The warmth of the pot-belly stove hit him, along with the smell of dried apples and kerosene. Mrs. Brody, a widow with a face like a dried plum and a tongue sharp enough to shear sheep, was behind the counter measuring out calico for a younger woman. The conversation stopped the moment the doorbell jingled. "Mrs." Brody looked over her spectacles. "Mr. Boone. We did not expect to see you until the thaw was proper. I need flour," Elias said, walking to the counter, "and coffee, and 5 pounds of sugar. Mrs." Brody weighed the sugar in silence. Her lips pursed so tight they disappeared. The younger woman gathered her parcels and scurried out, shooting a wide-eyed, scandalous look at Elias as she passed. "I hear the young woman is recovering, Mrs." Brody said, not looking at him. "She is," Elias said. "It is a miracle, I suppose, Mrs." Brody said, snapping the twine on the package, though some might say it is barely decent. A man and an unmarried woman, alone in that cabin for 3 weeks. People talk. Mr. Boone. They worry about the morality of the situation. Elias felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. It was not shame. It was anger. She was dying. "Mrs. Brody," Elias said, his voice hard. "Was I supposed to leave her in the snow to keep her reputation clean?" "Mrs. Brody sniffed. "You are a bachelor." "Mr. Boone, she is, well, nobody knows who she is, do they? A woman who answers an advertisement in a newspaper. It suggests a certain lack of options. One wonders if she is no better than she ought to be." Elias slammed his hand down on the counter. The jar of peppermint sticks rattled. "She is a lady," he growled, "and she is under my protection. Anyone who insults her insults me." He threw a gold coin on the counter, grabbed his supplies, and walked out, leaving the widow staring open-mouthed. He marched to the stage depot, his blood boiling. He hated this town. He hated the smallness of their minds. But as he walked, a cold realization settled in his gut. They were right, not about Maggie's character, but about the situation. By keeping her there, alone and unmarried, he was ruining her. If she ever wanted to leave, to find a husband or a position elsewhere, the stain of this winter would follow her. He was trying to save her life, but he might be destroying her future. At the depot, Silas the station master pointed to a corner. Some trunks came in on the freight wagon yesterday. Silas mumbled. Scavenged from the ravine? Elias walked over. There were 2 trunks. One was smashed open, empty. The other was battered, the leather gouged, but the lock held. It had a brass tag. M. Hale. He ran his hand over the lid. This was all she had, a box of clothes and memories. Load it up, Elias said. The ride back was long. Elias wrestled with the thoughts in his head. He had lived alone for so long. He had forgotten the complex web of society. He had thought the ranch was an island, separate from the world. He was wrong. The world had long arms. He reached the cabin as the sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood orange. He saw the smoke curling from the chimney and felt a profound sense of relief. He knocked 3 times. Their signal. The bar scraped back, and the door opened. Maggie stood there, her face pale, a heavy iron poker gripped in her hand. When she saw it was him, she lowered the weapon, her shoulders sagging. "You are back," she breathed. Elias stepped inside, carrying the supplies and dragging the trunk. When Maggie saw the trunk, she let out a small cry. "My things," she whispered. She knelt beside it, touching the battered leather as if it were a living thing. "You found it. Some of it," Elias said. "The other one was gone." She opened the lid. Her hands shook as she pulled out a shawl, a few books, a small sewing kit. It was a meager collection for a whole life, but she pressed the shawl to her face and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Elias took off his coat and hung it up. He watched her. She looked so vulnerable kneeling there. He thought of the men in town, of Mrs. Brody's pinched face. He thought of the way Maggie had looked at him when he walked in, like he was her only safety. "Maggie," he said. She looked up, sensing the change in his tone. "I heard things in town today," he said, standing by the fire. He did not know how to do this. He had no practice with delicate words. "What things?" she asked, standing up slowly. "People talk," Elias said. "They know you are here. They know we are alone." Maggie's face hardened. She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive gesture. "Let them talk. I have done nothing wrong. I know that," Elias said quickly. "But they are saying it is not right. That a woman staying with a man who is not her kin is—" He could not finish the sentence. He did not want to repeat the vile words. "I see," Maggie said bitterly. "They think I am a fallen woman because I survived." Elias took a step toward her. "I will not let them speak ill of you, but I cannot stop the whispers. Maggie, not as long as things are as they are." He took a deep breath. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "There is a way to stop it," he said. "A way to protect your name." Maggie looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What way?" "We can marry," Elias said. The words hung in the air, heavy and blunt. Maggie stared at him. She did not blush. She did not smile. She went very still. "Marry," she repeated. "It was the original arrangement," Elias said, stumbling now, his hands twisting his hat. "You came here to be my wife. If we marry, legally, in the church, no one can say a word. You will be Mrs. Boone. You will have the protection of my name." Maggie turned away. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening snow. "Is that what you want, Elias?" she asked quietly. "To protect my name. It is the right thing to do," he said. "The right thing," she echoed. She spun around, and her eyes were blazing. "You want to marry me to fix a mess? You want to marry me because you feel responsible? Because you pulled me out of the snow, and now you are stuck with me?" "That is not it," Elias protested. "Isn't it?" she demanded. She walked toward him, her voice rising. "Do you think I have not seen this before? Men who think they are doing a woman a favor. Poor Maggie, she has nowhere to go. Let me take her in." "I am not those men," Elias growled. "Then stop sounding like them," she cried. She stopped, her chest heaving. The anger drained out of her, leaving her looking small and tired. "I have been a transaction my whole life." "Elias," she said, her voice trembling. "My father married me off to a clerk when I was 17 to pay a debt. When he died, I was passed around to boarding houses and employers who looked at me like I was a piece of meat on a counter. I answered your letter because I wanted a choice. I wanted to choose my life." She looked at him, tears standing in her eyes. "If you marry me out of pity, or out of duty, or because Mrs. Brody made you feel ashamed, I will not do it. I would rather walk out into that snow." Elias stared at her. He saw the fierce pride in her, the steel spine that had carried her 2,000 miles, and he realized he had been a fool. He had been trying to be practical, to be noble, and he had insulted her. He dropped his hat on the table. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she had to look up at him. "I do not pity you, Margaret," he said. His voice was low and steady. "I admire you. You are the strongest person I have ever met." He looked down at his hands, then back at her face. "I am a lonely man," he admitted. "I have been alone so long I forgot how to speak to people. I forgot what it was like to have a light in this cabin. When I rode into town today, I hated leaving. I hated the miles between us." He took a breath. "I am not asking you to marry me to save your reputation. I am asking because I want you here. I want to see you across the table every morning. I want to know you are safe." Maggie searched his face. She saw the honesty there, stripped bare of pretense. She saw the fear in him, too, the fear that she would say no. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "If I agree," she said, her voice steadying. "I have conditions." Elias nodded. "Name them." "I will not be a silent partner," she said. "I will not be property. If I have a thought, I will speak it. If I want to learn to ride or shoot or manage the books, you will teach me. I am not just a wife to mend your shirts. Elias, I am a partner." Elias smiled. It was a rare, slow expression that transformed his rugged face. "I would expect nothing less," he said, "and," she added, her voice dropping, looking at her boots. "You will not expect—" She stopped, her face flushing. Elias understood. He remembered the fear in the night. "I will never force you, Maggie," he said solemnly. "I will never touch you unless you want me to. That is a promise on my mother's Bible." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "All right. Elias, I will marry you." 2 days later, they rode into town. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the sun dazzling on the melting snow. Maggie wore her best dress from the trunk, a dark navy wool that she had steamed and pressed. She wore a hat with a small velvet ribbon. She sat tall in the saddle of the mare Elias had saddled for her, though her knuckles were white on the reins. They went straight to the church. It was a small, whitewashed building with a bell that only rang on Sundays and for funerals. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, was a thin man with a perpetually runny nose. He looked surprised to see them, and even more surprised when Elias produced the license he had purchased from the county clerk. "Now?" Reverend Thomas asked, wiping his nose. "On a Tuesday?" "Now," Elias said. The ceremony was brief. The station master Silas and his wife were pulled in as witnesses. The church was cold, our breath misting in the air. Maggie stood beside Elias. He looked towering in his Sunday suit, which was a little tight across the shoulders. He smelled of bay rum and nervous sweat. When the preacher asked for the ring, Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a simple band of gold. It was not new. It had been his grandmother's, but he had polished it until it shone. He took Maggie's hand. Her fingers were cold. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a little loose, but it stayed. "With this ring, I thee wed," he rumbled. As he spoke, he looked at her, really looked at her. And Maggie looked back. In that dusty, cold church, with the town gossips whispering outside, a current passed between them. It was fear, yes, but it was also a spark, a recognition. "We are in this together now. You may kiss the bride," the preacher mumbled. Elias hesitated. He leaned down slowly. Maggie did not pull away. He pressed his lips to her cheek, chaste and quick. His unshaven jaw grazed her skin, rough and warm. When they walked out of the church, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Brody was there, watching with narrowed eyes. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking to stare. "Let them look," Elias muttered. He helped Maggie onto her horse. As he adjusted her stirrup, his hand lingered on her boot for a second. "Ready, Mrs. Boone?" he asked. The name sent a shiver through her. Mrs. Boone. It was a shield. "Ready," she said. The ride home was different than the ride in. The silence was not heavy. It was charged. The wind had picked up, cutting across the plains with a bite that promised one last freeze before true spring. Maggie shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. Without a word, Elias guided Rusty closer to her mare. He reached out and pulled the collar of her coat up, tucking it around her neck to block the wind. His fingers brushed her throat, warm and calloused. He did not say anything poetic. He did not recite a sonnet. He just fixed her coat. But in that gesture, Maggie felt more cherished than she ever had in her life. Night fell over the ranch, deep and absolute. The cabin was the same rough logs, the same stone hearth, but it felt fundamentally altered. The air was thick with the knowledge of what they had done. They ate supper in near silence. The clink of forks on tin plates sounded like cannon fire. When the meal was done, Elias banked the fire. Maggie stood by the bed, their bed now. She began to take down her hair. Her hands trembled as she pulled the pins out one by one. The dark, heavy mass fell down her back. Elias sat on the bench, pulling off his boots. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time. One boot thudded to the floor, then the other. He stood up and turned to face her. He was in his stocking feet, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Maggie stood frozen. The old panic flared in her chest, the memory of the locked room in Chicago, the heavy breathing of Mr. Caro. She felt trapped. Elias saw it. He stopped 5 feet away. "Maggie," he said softly. "I'm scared," she whispered. The confession tore out of her. "I'm sorry, Elias, but I am scared." Elias nodded. "I know." He took a step closer, moving as one would toward a skittish colt. "You are not trapped here," he said, "and I am not them." He reached out a hand, palm up, an invitation, not a command. She looked at his hand. It was the hand that had dug her out of the snow, the hand that had cleaned her wounds, the hand that had placed a ring on her finger. She took a breath, steeling herself, and stepped forward. She placed her hand in his. Elias closed his fingers around hers. He pulled her gently, not toward the bed, but just toward him. She came until she was standing in the circle of his arms, though he did not touch her body yet. "Look at me," he said. She looked up. His eyes were dark pools of warmth. "I'm your husband," he said, "but first, I am your friend. Do you believe that?" "I believe it," she whispered. "Then trust me," he said. He lowered his head. This time, he did not aim for her cheek. He pressed his lips to hers. It was tentative at first, a question asked in the dark. "Is this all right?" Maggie stood rigid for a second, but then she felt the warmth of his mouth. She felt the restraint in him, the way he was holding himself back, terrifyingly strong, but keeping all that power in check just for her. She let out a soft sigh, and her body softened. She leaned into him. The kiss deepened. It changed from a question to a statement. Elias groaned low in his throat, a sound of hunger that he couldn't suppress. His arms came around her, pulling her flush against his chest. Maggie felt the hard wall of his chest, the heavy thud of his heart against her own. She felt the heat of him seeping into her, and for the first time in her life, she felt a flare of desire that was her own. It wasn't about pleasing a man. It was about the sudden, sharp need to be close to this man. She reached up and tangled her fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck. Elias broke the kiss, gasping for air. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut. "Maggie," he rasped, "if we do not stop, I will not be able to stop." Maggie trembled. She wanted him. She was surprised by how much she wanted him, but the fear was still there, a cold shadow at the edge of the heat. She wasn't ready to let go completely. "Not yet, not yet," she whispered. "Please." Elias nodded. He took a shuddering breath and stepped back, his hands sliding down her arms to hold her hands. "Not yet," he agreed. They slept in the same bed that night. It was a narrow bed, built for one man. They lay on their sides, facing away from each other at first, but the cold of the night pushed them together. Eventually, Elias turned. He spooned his body around hers, wrapping his arm over her waist. He did not grope or push. He simply held her, a solid, heavy weight anchoring her to the earth. Maggie lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside. She felt the rise and fall of his chest against her back. She felt the calloused roughness of his hand resting on her stomach. She was Mrs. Elias Boone. She was a wife. Outside, the ground was still frozen mud. The spring was coming, but it was coming slowly, fighting for every inch of ground. It would be a hard season. There would be storms and mud and cold snaps. But as she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her husband's body lull her toward sleep, Maggie reckoned they would handle the weather. They had survived the wreck. They could survive the thaw. She covered his hand with hers, interlaced their fingers, and slept. Spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not with a gentle unfurling of flowers, but with a violent, muddy upheaval. The snow retreated up the slopes of the Absaroka Range, leaving behind a land that was sodden, brown, and waking up hungry. The creek swelled to a roar, brown water chewing at the banks, and the wind shifted from the biting northerly gales to a blustery western force that smelled of wet sage and thawing earth for Elias and Maggie Boone. The change in season marked a shift in their own lives. The claustrophobic intimacy of the winter cabin gave way to the demanding rhythm of the ranch. Maggie proved to be stronger than her slender frame suggested. She discarded her city boots for a pair of rough hide ones Elias had bartered for in town, and she pinned her skirts up to keep them out of the muck. She did not complain. When the calving season hit its peak, she was there in the corral. Mud streaked across her cheek, holding a lantern high while Elias worked to pull a breech calf from a heaving heifer. "Hold it steady, Maggie." Elias grunted, his arm deep inside the animal. "I've got it," she said, her voice calm despite the blood and the steam rising in the cold night air. When the calf finally slid out, wet and blinking, Elias stood back, wiping his brow with his forearm. He looked at his wife. She was tired, her hair escaping her bonnet, shivering slightly in the damp air, but there was a light in her eyes as she watched the mother cow turn to lick the newborn. "You did good," Elias said quietly. Most women from back east would have fainted at the smell. Maggie smiled, a small, tired curving of her lips. "I told you, Elias." "I am not delicate. I just needed a chance to breathe." They were partners now. It was an unspoken contract, sealed in sweat and shared exhaustion. She learned to ride the mare, learning to sit deep in the saddle and move with the animal rather than bouncing against it. She took over the supply ledger, her neat handwriting turning his chaotic scribbles into an organized inventory of flour, coffee, and ammunition. But the land did not reward their partnership with kindness. In late April, a sudden freeze snapped down from the north, killing the buds on the cottonwoods. They lost 2 calves that night, finding them frozen in the high pasture. Elias spent the morning digging shallow graves in the hard earth, his face set in a grim mask. Maggie stood beside him, silent, handing him the stones to cover the turned earth so the wolves would not dig them up. A week later, a hailstorm swept across the plains. The sky turned a bruised green, and ice the size of robins' eggs hammered the roof like gunshot. When it passed, Maggie's small vegetable patch, where she had painstakingly coaxed peas and carrots from the soil, was flattened into green pulp. She stood looking at the ruin, her hands twisting in her apron. Elias walked up behind her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a warm wall at her back. "We will plant again," he said. "It is too late in the season," Maggie whispered. "Then we will trade for potatoes in the fall," Elias said firmly. "The land takes what it wants. Maggie, we just have to hold on to what is left." They were holding on, but the town of Bitter Creek was making it difficult. The community had not forgotten the scandal of the winter. When Elias and Maggie rode in for Sunday service, a concession Elias made because he knew Maggie missed the hymns. The reception was chilly. The women of the congregation, in their stiff bonnets and dark wool, offered polite nods that did not reach their eyes. They gathered in tight circles after the sermon, their whispers audible like the rustling of dry leaves. Sudden marriage. No family to speak of. Living in sin for a month. Mrs. Brody was the ringleader. She cornered Maggie by the church steps, her smile tight and predatory. "Mrs. Boone," she said, making the name sound like a question. "I suppose you are finding our rough ways difficult after your colorful life in the city. I find the honesty of the land refreshing." "Mrs. Brody," Maggie said, keeping her chin high. "Honesty is a virtue, Mrs." Brody sniffed. "Though one wonders about the company one keeps. My late husband always said you can judge a horse by its teeth and a woman by her stock. And we know so little of your stock. My dear." Maggie felt the heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could answer, Elias was there. He placed a hand on Maggie's elbow, his grip gentle but possessive. "We are leaving." "Maggie," he said, his voice flat. "Mrs. Brody." He steered her away, but the poison had been administered. The doubt was there, floating in the air of the town like dust. The poison took a shape 2 weeks later. Elias was at the blacksmith's shed, getting a new shoe fitted for Rusty. Miller, the smith, was hammering a piece of red-hot iron, sparks flying in the gloom. 2 strangers rode in yesterday, Miller said, not looking up from his work. Slick fellows, city clothes. Elias stiffened. Strangers were rare. Strangers asking questions were trouble. "What did they want?" Elias asked. Asked about the wagon wreck. Miller said, asked if any property had been recovered, and they asked about a woman, Margaret Hale. Elias felt a cold stone drop into his stomach. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I did not know any Hale," Miller grunted, plunging the iron into a bucket of water. Steam hissed violently. "Told them a Mrs. Boone lived out your way, though." Elias stared at the smith's back. Miller turned, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "They say she took something. Elias, money, maybe jewelry. Said she robbed a trunk before the snow covered the wreck." Elias felt a flash of white-hot anger, followed immediately by a sick dread. He knew Maggie. He knew her hands, her heart, her quiet courage. She was no thief. But he also knew there were shadows in her eyes when she talked about the past. He knew she had arrived with nothing. "They are liars," Elias said. Miller shrugged. "Maybe, but they look like men who know the law. And they are headed your way." Elias did not wait for the horseshoe. He threw a coin on the anvil, mounted Rusty, and rode for the ranch as if the devil were snapping at his heels. He arrived to find 2 horses tied at his hitching rail. They were fine animals, thoroughbreds, not range ponies. He dismounted, loosening the thong on his holster, and walked up the steps. Maggie was standing on the porch. She was pale, her back pressed against the log wall as if she were trying to merge with the wood. Standing in the yard were 2 men. One was tall and thin, with spectacles and a notebook. The other was broader, dressed in a checked suit that was dusty from travel, wearing a bowler hat. He had a face that was soft, but his eyes were hard, shiny beads. Elias stepped onto the porch, placing himself between Maggie and the men. "Get off my land," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, like thunder before a storm. The man in the bowler hat smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Mr. Boone, I presume," the man said. "I am Mr. Caro. This is my associate, Mr. Finch. We are here to clarify some legal matters regarding the unfortunate incident at the pass. Caro." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. This was the landlord. The man who had tried to force himself into her room. The man she had fled. Maggie made a small, choked sound behind him. "I know who you are," Elias said, his hand hovering near his gun. "And I know what you are. You have 5 seconds to mount up and ride out before I forget I am a civilized man. Mr. Caro did not flinch. He reached into his coat pocket. Elias tensed, his hand dropping to his Colt, but Caro only produced a folded paper. "We are not here for violence." Mr. Boone, Caro said smoothly. We are here for justice and for restitution. He unfolded the paper. We have witness testimony that implies your wife, the former Miss Hale, misappropriated valuables from the wreckage of the wagon train, specifically a carpet bag containing $500 in gold coin and a diamond brooch, belonging to the late Mrs. Jensen. Lies, Elias spat. Is it? Caro looked past Elias at Maggie. His eyes raked over her with a familiar, oily possessiveness that made Elias's blood boil. Tell him, Maggie. Tell him how you paid for your ticket west. Tell him what you grabbed when the wagon went over. Maggie was trembling. Elias could feel the vibration of her fear through the floorboards. I did not steal, she whispered. Caro took a step forward. You were desperate, my dear. You ran from me, from your debts, in the middle of the night. You had nothing, and yet, here you are, and the Jensen bag is missing. He looked at Elias. We are prepared to be reasonable. Mr. Boone, return the stolen property, and perhaps we can avoid a messy trial. A trial that would, of course, expose Miss Hale's colorful history in Chicago to your neighbors. Elias stepped down the stairs, bringing his face inches from Caro's. She is Mrs. Boone, he said, his voice trembling with restrained violence. And if you say her name again with that filth in your mouth, I will break your jaw. Caro stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. Threats will not help you, he said cold. If the property is not returned, we will file charges, theft, flight to avoid prosecution, and we will seek damages against you, Mr. Boone, for harboring a fugitive. We will take this land as restitution. He turned to his associate. Come, Finch. We have business with the territorial judge. They mounted their horses. Caro looked down at Elias one last time. You have bought yourself a great deal of trouble. Cowboy, I hope she is worth it. They rode out, dust swirling in their wake. Elias stood watching them go until they were out of sight. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He turned slowly to face his wife. Maggie was sitting on the bench by the door, her face buried in her hands. She looked small and broken. Elias walked over to her. He wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but the doubt was a splinter in his mind. $500, a diamond brooch. Maggie, he said. She looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with tears. Did you take it? He asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Maggie let out a sob. She stood up, wringing her hands. Elias, you have to understand, she said, her voice frantic. The wreck. It was chaos. The wagon was tipping. People were screaming. I was thrown against the trunk. She took a breath, her chest heaving. I grabbed a bag. She confessed. I thought it was mine. My carpet bag looked just like Mrs. Jensen's, small, floral pattern, in the snow, in the dark. I just grabbed it and crawled. She looked at him, pleading. I did not open it until I was pinned under the wreckage. I felt the shape of it. It was heavy, too heavy to be my clothes. I realized then, and, Elias asked, I held onto it. She whispered. I was going to give it back, I swear. Elias, I was going to find Mrs. Jensen. But then the cold came, and the pain. And when you found me, I dropped it. It must be out there still, buried in the mud. She reached out, touching his sleeve. I did not steal it to come here. I worked 3 jobs to pay for my ticket. I scrubbed floors. I sewed until my fingers bled. I ran from Caro because he would not take no for an answer. But I never stole. Elias looked down at her. He saw the terror in her face. It was the terror of a trapped animal, a creature that has been kicked and hunted its whole life. He looked at her hands. They were rough now, scarred from the ranch work, but they were honest hands. He remembered the way she had looked when he pulled her from the snow, holding nothing but her life. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind. Then he opened them and took her face in his hands. I believe you, he said. Maggie collapsed against him, weeping. He held her, stroking her hair, feeling the shuddering sobs rack her body. But believing her was not enough. Caro had the law, or a twisted version of it, on his side. And he had money. "We have a fight coming." "Maggie," Elias said into her hair, a hard one. The days that followed were suffocating. The ranch, once a sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every rider on the horizon made Elias reach for his rifle. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a sheriff's warrant. The threat of losing the land gnawed at Elias. This ranch was his penance. It was the only thing he had built that was clean. To lose it because of a lie. It made a dark anger simmer in his gut. He withdrew. He stopped talking at dinner. He spent his days riding the far fence line, working until his muscles screamed, trying to exhaust the rage so he wouldn't turn it on the world. Maggie watched him from the window. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way the lines around his eyes deepened. She felt the weight of her own guilt crushing her. He is losing everything because of me. She began to think of leaving. If she ran, if she disappeared into the night, Caro would follow her. He would leave Elias alone. The ranch would be safe. It was a noble thought, but it terrified her. She looked at Elias sitting by the fire, mending a harness in grim silence, and her heart ached. She loved him. She loved the way he looked at the sky in the morning. She loved the rough warmth of his hands. She loved him with a desperation that was almost painful. Walking away from him would be like cutting out her own heart, but staying seemed selfish. One evening, the tension in the cabin finally snapped. It started over something small. Elias had come in late, tracking mud on the floor Maggie had just swept. She made a comment, sharp with stress. He snapped back. "Do not nag me." "Woman," he growled, "I have enough wolves at the door without you adding to the noise." Maggie froze. The unfairness of it stung her tears. "I am not nagging," she said. "I am trying to keep this home decent." "Decent?" Elias laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "We are about to be thrown into the street. Maggie, clean floors will not save us." "Then maybe I should go," Maggie cried. The words rang in the room. Elias slowly turned to face her. The harness dropped from his hands. "What did you say?" he asked softly. "Maybe I should go," Maggie repeated, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "If I leave, Caro follows me. He wants me, Elias. He wants to punish me. If I go, he leaves you the land." She took a step toward the door. "I can pack tonight. I can take the mare. I will ride for the railhead." She expected him to argue logic. She expected him to maybe even agree, to see the practical sense of it. She did not expect him to cross the room in 2 strides and grab her shoulders, shaking her hard. "Stop it," he roared. "Elias, you think you can just leave?" he shouted. His face twisted with an emotion she had never seen there. Panic. "You think you can walk out of here and save me? It saves the ranch," she cried. "Damn the ranch," Elias yelled. He let her go, stepping back, raking his hands through his hair. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "Do you not understand?" he said, his voice cracking. "The land is dirt. It is grass and rocks. I can find more dirt, but I cannot find another you." Maggie stared at him, stunned into silence. He looked at her, his eyes wild and raw. "I killed a man once. Maggie, I watched the light go out of his eyes, and part of me died with him. I spent 10 years acting like a ghost, just waiting to fade away." He took a step toward her, his hands shaking. "Then you came. You came out of the snow, and you woke me up. You made me want to be alive again." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers trembling against her skin. "If you leave to protect this pile of logs, you will shatter me. I will not survive it. Maggie, I will not survive losing you." The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. It was not the polite declaration of a husband. It was the desperate plea of a man standing on the edge of an abyss. "Elias," she whispered. She saw it then. It wasn't obligation. It wasn't pity. It was love. Deep, terrified, overwhelming love. She made a small sound and threw herself at him. He caught her, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck. "Do not leave me," he choked out. "Never," she promised. sobbing. Never! They clung to each other as if the floor were falling away beneath them. The fear of the past weeks, the anger, the doubt, it all transmuted into a frantic, blinding need. Elias found her mouth. He kissed her, not with the gentle restraint of their wedding night, but with a starving intensity. He tasted of salt and desperation. Maggie kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting to merge with him so completely that no lawman or landlord could ever pry them apart. He carried her to the bed, stumbling a little, never breaking the kiss. They fell onto the quilt together, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing. His hands were everywhere, on her waist, her hips, smoothing the hair back from her face. She felt the heavy weight of him pressing her into the mattress, and it felt like safety. It felt like home. Elias. She breathed against his lips. He pulled back, gasping, his pupils blown wide. He looked at her with a heat that scorched her skin. He moved his hand to the buttons of her bodice. His fingers shook. Maggie arched into his touch, her body screaming for him. But then, a shadow passed over his face. He stopped. His hand hovered over her heart. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, he groaned. He rolled off her, landing on his back on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling. Elias? Maggie whispered, confused, her body aching with the loss of his contact. We cannot, he rasped. He turned his head to look at her. His eyes were full of regret, but his jaw was set. Not like this, Maggie, not while he is out there, not while they are calling you a thief and threatening to tear us apart. He reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. When I take you, he said fiercely, it will be because we are free. It will be a celebration, not a desperate escape. I will not let Caro stain this, too. Maggie looked at him. She understood. He wanted their union to be pure, untouched by the fear that was hunting them. She moved closer, curling her body against his side. She rested her head on his shoulder. You are a stubborn man, Elias Boone, she whispered. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling the quilt up over them both. We wait, he said. We fight them. We win. And then, he left the sentence unfinished, but the promise in his voice made her shiver. 2 days later, the summons arrived. It was delivered by the county sheriff, a man named Webb who looked apologetic as he handed the paper to Elias. Hearing is set for Tuesday, Webb said, tipping his hat to Maggie. Judge Holloway is presiding. He's a fair man, Elias, but he follows the book. You bring your evidence. We will be there, Elias said, crumpling the paper in his fist. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear. The wind whipped across the plains, flattening the new grass. Elias dressed in his dark suit. He cleaned his boots until they shone. He checked his revolver, spun the cylinder, and then, after a long moment, left it hanging on the hook by the door. He would not walk into court with a gun. He would walk in with the truth. Maggie dressed in her navy wool. She braided her hair tightly, pinning it back with severe precision. She looked pale, but her eyes were dry. They walked out to the horses. Elias helped her mount the mare. He swung up onto Rusty. He looked at the ranch, the cabin, the barn, the fence line stretching out toward the mountains. He memorized it, the way the light hit the eaves, the smell of the pine. If they lost today, this would be a memory. He looked at Maggie. She was watching him. She reached out across the gap between their horses. Elias took her hand. His grip was crushing. Whatever happens, she said, her voice fighting the wind. We are together. Elias nodded. He brought her gloved hand to his lips and kissed the knuckles. Together, he said. He released her hand. They turned their horses toward the road. The horizon was wide and uncertain, a line of blue distance that promised nothing. The wind whipped at Maggie's skirts and tore at Elias's hat brim. The road ahead was dangerous. It could cost them everything they owned. But as they rode side by side, their knees brushing occasionally, Elias felt a strange, grim calm settle over him. He had spent his life running from a death. Now, he was riding toward a life, and for the woman beside him, he would face the devil himself and refuse to blink. The wooden steps of the Bitter Creek courthouse groaned under the weight of the gathering crowd. It was a Tuesday, usually a day for quiet commerce and saloon idling. But today the dusty street was alive with a tension that hummed like a telegraph wire. The town had turned out not for justice, but for theater. Elias Boone rode Rusty to the hitching rail, Maggie's mare close beside him. He dismounted and moved to help her down, his body blocking the view of the loafers leaning against the general store. When Maggie's boots touched the dirt, he did not let go of her hand. "Keep your head up," he said. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You have done nothing to be ashamed of." Maggie nodded, though her throat felt constricted, as if a rope were already tightening there. She wore her navy wool dress, the high collar stifling in the unseasonable warmth of the crowded street. She could feel the eyes on her. They pricked her skin like burrs. "Look at her," a woman whispered loud enough to be heard. "Acts like a lady, but we heard the stories." "She ran off with a rancher's money," another voice muttered. Elias stiffened, his jaw tightening into a line of white granite. He walked Maggie toward the double doors of the courthouse, his stride heavy and deliberate. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of a primal instinct to avoid the dangerous energy radiating from the big rancher. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of old tobacco, sweat, and floor wax. Judge Holloway sat behind a scarred oak desk on a raised platform. He was a man carved from the same rough timber as the territory itself, gray-haired, heavy-lidded, with eyes that had seen every variety of frontier lie. Mr. Caro and his associate, Mr. Finch, were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Caro looked impeccable in a fresh suit, his bowler hat resting on the table like a trophy. He turned as they entered, offering a small, pitying smile that made Maggie's stomach turn over. Elias guided Maggie to the defendant's bench. He sat beside her, his hat on his knee, his presence a solid wall against the room. Judge Holloway banged a wooden gavel. The sound cracked like a pistol shot, silencing the murmurs in the gallery. "This hearing is in session," the judge rumbled. "We are here to determine the validity of the claim brought by Mr. Caro regarding the theft of property from the wagon train wreckage at Granite Pass. Mr. Caro, state your case." Caro stood up. He buttoned his jacket with slow, practiced movements. He spoke with the smooth, cultivated cadence of the East, a stark contrast to the rough drawl of the locals. "Your Honor," he began, gesturing toward Maggie, "we do not wish to be harsh. We understand that the wilderness drives people to desperation. Miss Hale, pardon me, Mrs. Boone, was in a difficult position. She had fled her obligations in Chicago. She was alone. When the wagon wrecked, she saw an opportunity." He paced the floor, acting the part of the reluctant accuser. "A carpetbag belonging to Mrs. Jensen, containing $500 in gold and jewelry, went missing. Mrs. Boone admits to being at the scene. She admits to taking a bag. We submit that she did not take it by accident, but by design. She saw a chance to finance her new life, to secure a future that her own station could not provide." He turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. "Is it not natural? A destitute woman, frightened, seizing a lifeline. We only ask for the return of the property. We ask for justice for the late Mrs. Jensen's family." The courtroom murmured in agreement. It was a good story. It made sense to them. Maggie felt the weight of their belief pressing down on her. They wanted her to be guilty. It made the world easier to understand if the stranger was the villain. "Mrs. Boone," the judge said, turning his gaze on her. "Take the stand." Maggie stood up. Her legs felt like water. She walked to the witness chair and sat down, placing her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "Tell us what happened," the judge said. Maggie took a breath. She looked at Elias. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. "It was snowing," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Speak up," the judge commanded. "It was snowing," she said louder, though her voice shook. The wind was screaming. "The lead wagon slipped. I heard the driver shout, and then the world turned over." She closed her eyes, the memory assaulting her. "I was thrown. I hit the ground hard. There was wood splintering, horses screaming. It was dark and cold. Your Honor, I crawled through the snow. I could not feel my feet. I saw a trunk smashed open. I saw a bag. She opened her eyes, looking directly at the judge. My bag was a floral carpet bag. The one on the ground looked the same. I grabbed it. I did not check inside. I just wanted something to hold on to. I wanted to know I was still me. And when did you realize it was not yours? Caro asked, stepping forward. Maggie flinched. Later, she said. When I was pinned, I felt the weight of it. And yet, Caro said, his voice sharpening, you did not give it to the station master when you were rescued. You did not mention it to Mr. Boone. I was dying. Maggie cried. I was frozen. I do not remember everything. I dropped it in the mud when Elias pulled me out. Convenient, Caro sneered. You dropped the gold, but you kept your life. Objection, Elias growled, half rising from his seat. Sit down. Mr. Boone, the judge warned. Caro smiled. He turned back to Maggie. Let us speak of your character, Mrs. Boone. You say you are an honest woman. Yet, in Chicago, you lived alone. You had no family. You were dismissed from your employment after an altercation with a gentleman. I was defending myself, Maggie said, her face flushing hot. He tried to touch me. Caro raised an eyebrow. So you say. But a pattern emerges. Does it not? A woman alone. A woman who misunderstands the intentions of men. A woman who takes what she thinks she is owed. He leaned in close to the witness stand. The smell of his cologne, expensive and cloying, made Maggie gag. You used Mr. Boone to get a roof over your head, he said softly. Why should we believe you did not use Mrs. Jensen's gold to get a ticket? I did not, Maggie insisted, tears spilling over. The crowd whispered louder. She is crying. Guilty tears. Elias could not take it any more. He stood up, ignoring the judge's gavel. Your Honor, he bellowed. The room went silent. Elias walked to the center of the floor. He held his hat in his hands, crushing the brim. I am not a lawyer, Elias said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. I do not have fancy words, but I know this woman. Mr. Boone, you are out of order, the judge said, though he did not bang the gavel again. Let me speak, Elias said. He turned to the crowd. You all know me. You know I live quiet. You know I keep to myself. You know about the scar on my face. He touched the jagged white line on his jaw. 10 years ago, I killed a man in a fair fight in Kansas. I have lived with that ghost every day. I get letters from his brother promising to put a bullet in my back. I am a man with blood on his hands. The crowd stared. They knew the rumors, but to hear him say it, to hear him admit to the darkness, was different. I know what guilt looks like, Elias said. I see it in the mirror every morning. And I know what innocence looks like. He pointed at Maggie. That woman walked through hell to get here. She fought storms and starvation. She did not do it for gold. She did it because she has a heart that is too big for this small, mean world. She is my wife, and she is the most honest thing in this room. He turned to Caro. You want to talk about character? You are a man who hunts a woman across 3 states for a bag of coins. That tells me all I need to know about your character. There was a silence in the courtroom, a heavy, thoughtful silence. Then, the back door swung open. A man walked in. He was old, dressed in buckskins that had seen better decades, with long gray hair and a face like a dried apple. It was the trail scout Elias had met in the saloon months ago. I have something to say, the scout rasped. Judge Holloway peered over his spectacles. Identify yourself. Name is Jim, the scout said. Just Jim. I was out at the pass 3 days after the wreck, before the snow melted. He walked to the front, ignoring Caro's attempts to block him. I found this. Jim said. He pulled a small object from his pocket and tossed it onto the judge's desk. It was a silver pocket watch. Found it half a mile down the draw, Jim said, along with a lady's hat and a busted violin. What is your point? Caro snapped. Point is, Jim said, turning to look at the city man with contempt. The wreckage was scattered for miles. Coyotes dragged things, wind blew things. And there were tracks. Tracks? The judge asked. Shod horses. Jim said, not Mustang. 2 riders. picked through the site before Mr. Boone ever got there, looted the easy stuff. He looked at Caro. Maybe the lady did not take your bag. Maybe someone else beat you to it. Or maybe you just want to pin it on her because she is an easy target. Caro's face turned a mottled red. This is hearsay. This is a senile old man. Jim spat on the floor. I track better than you lie. Son. The judge looked at the watch, then at Caro. It seems there is significant doubt as to the chain of events. Judge Holloway said. Caro slammed his hand on the table. She owed me, he shouted, his composure shattering like glass. The room gasped. She lived in my building, Caro yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Maggie. I gave her everything. I offered her a position. I offered her comfort. And she spat in my face and ran away like a thief. She owes me that money for the trouble she caused. Maggie shrank back in the chair. The truth was out. It was not about the gold. It was about ownership. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. So, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, this is a personal grievance. Mr. Caro? It is justice. Caro seethed. She belongs to me. Her debt belongs to me. Recess, the judge barked, banging the gavel. I will review the evidence. 15 minutes. The courtroom exploded into noise. Elias moved instantly to the witness stand, placing himself between Maggie and the room. Come on, he said gently. Let's get some air. He led her out the side door, into the alley beside the courthouse. The air was cooler there, in the shade. But Maggie was shaking so hard she could barely stand. He hates me, she whispered. He will never stop. He is finished, Elias said. He showed his hand. The judge saw it. Suddenly, the door behind them banged open. Caro burst out, followed by Finch. Caro's face was twisted in a mask of fury. You think you won? Caro hissed. He marched toward them. Elias stepped in front of Maggie, his hands loose at his sides. Back off. Caro, Elias warned. Caro ignored him. He lunged, reaching around Elias to grab Maggie's arm. You are coming with me, you little ingrate, Caro snarled. I will drag you back to Chicago in irons if I have to, Maggie screamed. Elias did not think. He moved. He shoved Caro back, a hard, open-handed strike to the chest that sent the man stumbling into the dust. Caro scrambled up, his hand going inside his coat. He has a gun, someone shouted from the street. Elias's hand blurred. In a heartbeat, his Colt was drawn, the hammer cocked, the barrel leveled at Caro's chest. Don't, Elias said. The word was flat. Final. Caro froze, his hand half withdrawn from his coat, gripping the pearl handle of a small pistol. He looked into the barrel of Elias's gun, and then he looked into Elias's eyes. He saw death there. He saw a man who had killed before and would do it again without hesitation to protect what was his. Drop it, Elias commanded. The alley was silent. The crowd from the courthouse had spilled out, watching in terrified fascination. Judge Holloway stood on the steps, witnessing it all. Caro's hand trembled, slowly, very slowly. He pulled the pistol out by 2 fingers and dropped it in the dirt. Elias did not lower his gun. Get on your horse, Elias said. Ride east. If I see you in this territory again, I will not ask you to leave. Caro looked at the judge, then at the crowd. He saw no sympathy. He saw only the hard, unforgiving face of the frontier. He spat on the ground, turned, and walked to his horse. Finch followed, looking pale and sick. Judge Holloway walked down the steps. He looked at Caro riding away, then at Elias, who was slowly uncocking his revolver and holstering it. Mr. Boone, the judge said. Your Honor, Elias said, touching his hat. The judge looked at Maggie, who was clinging to Elias's arm, pale as a sheet. Case dismissed. The judge said loudly. So the whole town could hear insufficient evidence of theft, the disputed assets, if found, will be auctioned for the county poor fund. He looked at Elias. And Mr. Boone? Yes, sir. You showed restraint today. Keep it that way. Yes, sir. The crowd began to disperse, their hunger for drama sated. They looked at Maggie differently now, not with judgment, but with a grudging respect. She had stood up. Her husband had drawn iron for her. In the West, that meant something. But Maggie did not feel triumphant. She felt hollowed out. "Let's go home," she whispered. They rode out of town in silence. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion. Maggie felt exposed. Caro's words echoed in her head. "She belongs to me. She used Mr. Boone." She looked at Elias's back. He rode straight, his eyes scanning the horizon. Did he believe it? Did he wonder, deep down, if she was just using him for safety? The sky began to darken as they reached the halfway point. The unseasonable heat had bred a monster. Clouds the color of bruised plums boiled up over the mountains, moving with terrifying speed. "Storm!" Elias shouted over the rising wind. "We will not make the ranch." Thunder cracked, shaking the ground. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in sheets, turning the dust to slick grease in seconds. "The line shack!" Elias yelled, pointing to a small, leaning structure near the creek bed, a relic from the old cattle drives. They kicked their horses into a gallop. Lightning stitched the sky, blinding white forks that made the horses scream. They reached the shack just as the heavens opened fully. Elias shoved the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. They led the horses into the small lean-to at the back, then ducked inside the main room. It was tiny, smelling of dry rot and rats. There was a single rough pallet in the corner and a broken chair. Elias lit the lantern he carried in his saddlebag. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. The rain hammered on the roof like 1,000 fists. It was deafening. Maggie stood in the center of the room, shivering. Her dress was soaked, plastering to her skin. Her hair had come loose, hanging in wet ropes around her face. She looked at Elias. He was watching her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she said. The word broke out of her. She wrapped her arms around herself. "You heard him," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "You heard what he said, that I am a user, that I am damaged goods." "Maggie," Elias started, stepping forward. "Do not," she cried, backing away. "Do not look at me with pity. Elias, I cannot bear it." "I saw your face in the courtroom. You had to stand there and listen to him list every shame I have ever had. You had to admit to a murder to save me." She sank down onto the pallet, burying her face in her hands. "I am dirty. Elias, I am trouble. You should have let him take me. You would be better off." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the drumming of the rain. Then she heard his boots on the floorboards. He knelt in front of her. He took her hands and pulled them away from her face. "Look at me," he commanded. She opened her eyes. Elias was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a fierce, burning intensity that took her breath away. "I did not see a dirty woman today," he said, his voice rough. "I saw a woman who stood before a judge and told the truth while a snake tried to strangle her. I saw a woman who has carried the weight of the world without breaking." He reached up and touched the wet hair at her temple. "You think I care about what Caro said? You think I care about your past? I care," she sobbed. "I wanted to be new for you. I wanted to be worthy." "Worthy?" Elias let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Maggie, look at me. Look at this scar. Look at these hands. I have killed. I have sinned. If anyone is unworthy in this room, it is me." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "But today, when I stood between you and him, I felt clean for the first time in 10 years. I felt clean because I was fighting for you." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "If the whole territory turned against you, Maggie, if every person in this world called you a thief and a whore, I would still choose you. I would choose you every time. I would burn the world down to keep you warm." Maggie stared at him. The truth of his words washed over her, hotter than the shame, stronger than the fear. He saw her, all of her, and he stayed. The dam inside her broke. "Elias," she whispered. She reached for him. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear of the past, no shadow of Caro. There was only the storm outside and the fire inside. Elias groaned as her arms went around his neck. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was urgent, desperate, a reclaiming of souls. He pressed her back onto the rough blankets of the pallet. The lantern light flickered wild and gold on the walls. He touched her as if he were memorizing her. His hands were rough, but his touch was reverent. He unbuttoned the wet wool of her dress, his fingers shaking with need. Maggie helped him, her own hands fumbling with his shirt. She wanted his skin against hers. She wanted the weight of him to ground her, to prove that she was here, she was safe, she was loved. When skin met skin, a shock went through them both. "You are sure?" Elias rasped, hovering over her, his eyes searching hers one last time. "I am yours," she whispered. "I have always been yours." He kissed her then, a deep, slow kiss that sealed the promise. The storm raged outside, wind howling like a demon denied. But inside the shack, the world narrowed down to the sound of breath and the heat of bodies. They came together not out of desperation, but out of a profound, terrifying trust. It was a shedding of old skins, a burning away of the ghosts that had haunted them both. In the darkness, amidst the smell of rain and old wood, they claimed each other. It was clumsy and fierce and beautiful. It was a language without words, spoken in the arch of a back and the clasp of a hand. And when the storm finally broke, leaving a silence that rang in their ears, they lay tangled together under the heavy coat Elias had thrown over them. Maggie rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She felt an ache in her body, a pleasant heaviness that anchored her to the earth. She traced the scar on his jaw with her fingertip. Elias caught her hand and kissed the palm. "Sleep," he murmured. "I have you?" Maggie woke to the sound of a bird singing. She opened her eyes. Light was slicing through the cracks in the shack's walls. Thin, brilliant beams of gold dust. She shifted. Elias was asleep beside her, one arm thrown protectively over her waist. His face, usually so guarded even in rest, looked younger, softened. She looked at the dust motes dancing in the light. She looked at the man who had drawn a gun for her. The shame was gone. It had been washed away by the rain and the truth. She knew the road ahead would be hard. The town would still talk. The winter would come again. The work would never end. But as she lay there, watching the dawn creep across the floorboards, Maggie Boone knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was home. She pressed a kiss to Elias's shoulder, closed her eyes, and let the morning light cover them both. The paper from Judge Holloway, stamped with the official seal of the territory, was tucked away in the bottom drawer of the dresser. It was a victory. Certainly, it was a shield against the legal wolves that had tried to devour them. But out here, where the wind scoured the earth and the sky stretched wide enough to swallow a man whole, a piece of paper offered little protection against the realities of life. Spring in Wyoming was a temperamental beast. It gave with one hand and took with the other. The snowmelt roared down from the Absaroka peaks, turning the dry creek beds into churning rivers of brown sludge. Elias and Maggie Boone rode the fence line, the mud sucking at the horses' hooves. The floodwaters had undercut the bank near the north pasture, taking out 50 yards of barbed wire and posts. "It is a mess," Elias shouted over the roar of the water. "We will have to restring the whole section before the herd moves up." Maggie nodded, wiping a splatter of mud from her cheek. She wore a heavy canvas coat Elias had cut down for her, and her hands were gloved in thick leather. She did not look like a fragile city woman anymore. She looked like she belonged to the landscape. "I will strip the wire," she called back. "You set the posts." Elias looked at her. A year ago, he would have told her to stay in the cabin. He would have tried to shield her from the grunt work. Now, he simply nodded. He handed her the wire cutters. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their labor establishing a new language between them. There was no need for polite conversation. There was only the grunt of effort, the screech of wire, the thud of the post-hole digger hitting wet earth. They were a team, a single organism with two hearts, fighting to hold their ground against a world that wanted to wash them away. When they returned to the cabin that evening, exhausted and aching, there was a different feeling in the air. It was not the desperate survival of the winter. It was the tired satisfaction of building something. Maggie heated the stew while Elias pulled off his boots. He watched her move around the kitchen. She walked with a new confidence, her spine straight. She was no longer the frightened bird he had dug out of the snow. She was Maggie Boone, and she was the strongest thing he had ever known. The town of Bitter Creek was slow to change its mind, but it respected grit, and the Boones had grit. When they rode into town 2 weeks later for supplies, the silence that greeted them was different. It was not the hostile, cold shoulder of before. It was a measured, assessing silence. They walked into the general store. The bell above the door jingled, "Mrs." Brody was behind the counter, stacking tins of coffee. She stiffened when she saw them, her hand pausing in midair. Elias stepped forward, ready to defend his wife, his shoulders squaring instinctively. But Maggie put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She walked up to the counter alone. "Good morning, Mrs. Brody," Maggie said. Her voice was calm, devoid of malice. "Mrs." Brody looked at Maggie. She looked at the mud on Maggie's hem, the weathered tan on her face, and the steady, unblinking gaze of her eyes. The widow seemed to deflate slightly, the pinch in her expression loosening. "Mrs. Boone, Mrs." Brody said. She cleared her throat, adjusting her spectacles. I trust the planting is going well. The frost took the peas," Maggie said, "but the potatoes are holding, Mrs." Brody nodded. She picked up a tin of coffee and set it down again, her fingers nervous. "I wish to say something," the older woman said, her voice tight. "I am a woman who prides herself on her judgment, but it seems I may have looked at the cover of the book and ignored the pages." She looked up, meeting Maggie's eyes. "The way you stood in that courtroom, Mrs." Brody continued, "and the way your husband stood for you, it was decent. I spoke too freely before. And for that, I offer an apology. It was not a warm embrace. It was not an offer of tea and friendship. But in the hard currency of the frontier, it was gold. Thank you, Mrs. Brody," Maggie said softly. "I accept it." From that crack in the wall, a new life began to grow. Maggie did not just accept the town's tolerance, she carved out a place in it. She put up a small notice on the community board. Sewing, mending, and alterations. Reasonable rates. M. Boone. At first, it was just the blacksmith's wife needing a dress let out. Then it was the banker's wife needing a coat relined. Maggie's stitches were tiny and precise, a skill honed in the sweatshops of Chicago, but now applied for her own gain. She sat on the porch of the ranch house in the afternoons, a basket of fabric at her feet, the needle flashing in the sun. Elias would watch her from the corral. He saw the pride in her face when she handed him a small stack of coins at the end of the month. "For the winter feed," she said, placing the money in his hand. "You earned this." "Maggie," Elias said, "keep it. Buy yourself something nice." She shook her head, closing his fingers over the coins. "We are partners. Elias, the feed is for the herd. The herd is for us." He looked at the coins, then at her. He realized then that she was healing a part of him he did not know was broken. She was teaching him that he did not have to carry the entire world on his shoulders alone. It was Reverend Thomas who brought the news. He rode out to the ranch on a mule that looked older than the hills, carrying a Bible and a grim expression. They sat on the porch, drinking lemonade that Maggie had made with the last of the sugar. "There is something you folks ought to know," the Reverend said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "About the wreck." Elias tensed. "Is Carol back?" "No, nothing like that." The Reverend said, "It is about survivors. We thought Mrs. Boone was the only one. But word came down from the homesteaders over in Red Rock." He took a sip of lemonade. "A boy was found, wandering near the creek bed about 5 miles east of the crash site. Must have been thrown clear and walked in the wrong direction." Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. "A boy? 6 years old," the Reverend said. "Name is Caleb. The Millers, those homesteaders out that way, they took him in temporary, but they have 7 of their own and barely enough corn to feed them. The boy is quiet, has not said a word since they found him." Maggie looked at Elias. Her eyes were wide, swimming with a sudden, fierce emotion. She remembered the chaos of that night, the screaming. He was there, she whispered. He was in the dark, just like me. Elias felt a knot of fear in his stomach. A child, a boy who had seen death. He looked at his own hands, hands that knew how to work and how to fight, but knew nothing of comforting a child. "Maggie," he said warningly. "We have to go see him," she said. Elias sighed. "Maggie, he survived." "Elias," she said, her voice rising. "He is alone. He thinks the world has ended. I know that feeling. I sat in that snow and thought nobody was coming." She reached out and took Elias's hand. "We have plenty of room. Elias, we have food." "It is not about food," Elias said quietly. "It is about, I am not a father. Maggie, I am a man with a scar and a bad reputation. What can I give a boy? You can give him what you gave me," she said simply. "A chance to breathe." 2 days later, they hitched the wagon and rode to Red Rock. The Miller homestead was a chaotic collection of sod structures and shouting children. Mrs. Miller, a harried woman with a baby on her hip, pointed them toward the barn. "He stays in there mostly," she said, looking tired. "He hides in the hayloft, does not eat much. We try, folks, but he is like a wild thing." Maggie climbed the ladder to the loft first. Elias waited at the bottom, feeling large and clumsy in the dim light. "Caleb," Maggie's voice was soft, a gentle melody in the dusty air. There was a rustle in the straw. A small face peered out from behind a stack of hay bales. The boy was thin, his eyes huge and dark, dominating his pale face. He looked like a cornered rabbit. Maggie did not rush him. She sat down on the floor, spreading her skirts. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a toy horse she had sewn from scraps of leather and wool, stuffed with dried grass. "Hello, Caleb," she said. "My name is Maggie. I was on the wagons too." The boy did not move, but his eyes locked onto the toy horse. "I was scared," Maggie said. "It was very cold, but a man came and found me, a big man with a kind voice." She glanced down through the trapdoor at Elias. Elias looked up, his heart hammering. "He is down there," Maggie said to the boy. "He is very strong, and he knows everything about horses." She set the toy on the floor and slid it forward. Caleb watched it. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he crawled out from the hay. He reached out a dirty hand and snatched the horse, pulling it to his chest. He looked at Maggie. He did not smile, but the terror in his eyes receded. Just a fraction. They stayed for an hour. Elias eventually came up. He did not say much. He just sat on a bale and whittled a piece of pine. Caleb watched him. When Elias finished, he handed the boy a small, smooth whistle. "Blow on that if you get scared," Elias said, his voice deep and grave. "It scares the wolves away." When they left, they did not take the boy. It was too soon, and the legalities were messy. But as they drove away, Maggie looked back at the barn. "He needs us," she said. Elias looked at the road ahead. He felt a strange weight in his chest. But it was not the heavy stone of guilt. It was the weight of possibility. He held on to the whistle. "Maggie," Elias said. He held it tight. It was a seed planted in the dry earth. They did not know if it would grow, but the hope of it lay between them, unspoken and fragile. Summer arrived, turning the plains into a sea of golden grass that rippled under the wind. The days were long and hot, the sun bleaching the wood of the cabin to a silvery gray. The marriage of Elias and Maggie Boone deepened like a river cutting a canyon. It was no longer the frantic, clinging need of the storm, nor the defiant stand of the courtroom. It was a steady, daily rhythm. They shared the evenings on the porch. Elias would smoke a pipe, the smoke drifting up to mingle with the scent of sage. Maggie would sit on the bench beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. His arm would come around her waist, pulling her close. It was a reflexive gesture now. He needed the weight of her against him to settle his mind. One night, Maggie woke with a gasp, her body jerking in the bed. Elias was awake instantly. He did not ask what it was. He knew. The nightmares of the wreck, or the phantom grip of Caro on her arm, still visited her. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her. "I have you," he murmured into her hair. "You are here. You are safe." Maggie trembled for a moment, then relaxed, her breathing synchronizing with his. "Do you think they ever go away?" she whispered in the dark. "The ghosts? I do not know," Elias admitted. "I still see the face of that boy in Kansas sometimes. I wonder if I will always be the man who killed him." Maggie turned in his arms, her hand coming up to touch his face in the darkness. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the scar that marked him. "You are not that man," she said fiercely. "You used your strength to save me. Elias, you used your gun to protect me. Violence is a tool. In your hands, it is a shield, not a weapon." Elias closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. She absolved him in a way no priest ever could. She knew the worst of him, and she loved him anyway. July brought the heat, baking the moisture out of the ground until the grass crunched underfoot like glass. The sky was a hazy white, breathless and still. The danger came on a Tuesday afternoon. A dry thunderstorm rolled off the mountains, all wind and lightning, no rain. A bolt struck the ridge 2 miles west of the ranch. Elias saw the smoke first. It was a thin gray column that grew instantly into a black wall. "Fire!" he shouted. "Running for the barn!" Maggie dropped her sewing basket and ran after him. The wind was pushing the flames straight toward the cabin and the barn. They had minutes, maybe an hour, before it reached the firebreak. "Get the sacks!" Elias yelled, hitching the team to the plow. "Soak them in the trough!" They worked with a frantic, desperate coordination. Elias drove the horses hard, cutting a wide furrow in the earth, trying to widen the gap between the fuel and their home. Maggie ran back and forth with wet burlap sacks, beating at the spot fires that jumped the line. The heat was solid, a physical wall that pushed against them. The smoke burned their lungs, making them cough and gag. "Elias!" Maggie screamed, pointing. A spark had landed on the roof of the barn. Elias abandoned the plow. He grabbed the ladder and a bucket of water. He scrambled up the roof, the shingles scorching his hands. He threw the water, hissing steam enveloping him. He beat the flames out with his jacket, roaring in defiance. Maggie was on the ground, stomping out embers that threatened the corral fence. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes streaming tears from the smoke. They fought for 3 hours. They fought until their muscles failed and their throats were raw. They fought side by side, equals in the face of the inferno. And then the wind shifted. It turned back on itself, pushing the fire toward the creek where it had no fuel. The roar died down to a crackle. The black wall of smoke began to dissipate. Elias climbed down from the roof. He stumbled and fell to his knees in the dirt. Maggie ran to him. She dropped to the ground, wrapping her arms around him. They were both black with soot, smelling of smoke and sweat. "We did it," she choked out. "We held it." Elias looked around. The land to the west was a charred, black wasteland. But the cabin stood, the barn stood, the cattle, spooked but safe, huddled in the far corner of the corral. He looked at Maggie. Her hair was singed at the ends. Her dress was ruined. She looked beautiful. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her neck. They held each other, swaying slightly, adrenaline crashing into exhaustion. The scorched earth stretched out before them, ugly and scarred. But as Elias looked at it, he saw something else. He saw survival. "It is just grass," he croaked. "It will grow back." That night, the sky cleared. The stars came out, impossibly bright against the velvet blackness. The air still smelled of smoke and pine resin, sharp and clean. They sat on the front steps of the cabin, wrapped in the Hudson's Bay blanket. They were too tired to wash the soot off completely. So they sat there, two dark figures in the night. Elias held Maggie between his legs, her back resting against his chest. He held her hands in his. "We need to fix the roof," he said quietly. Maggie laughed, a soft, tired sound. "And the fence, again. And we need to go back to Red Rock," Elias added. Maggie went still. She turned her head to look up at him. "For Caleb?" Elias nodded. "I was thinking, today, when the fire was coming, I thought about who would inherit this land, who would take care of it when we are gone." He squeezed her hand. "A boy needs a father who knows how to fight a fire, and he needs a mother who knows how to mend the burns. I think we can do that. Maggie." Maggie turned fully in his arms. Her eyes were shining with tears that had nothing to do with smoke. "Yes," she whispered. "We can do that." She reached up and kissed him. It was a slow, deep kiss, tasting of salt and promise. "Let's go inside," Elias said. They retreated into the cabin, shutting the door against the chill of the wilderness. They did not light the lamp. The light from the dying embers in the stove cast a warm, red glow across the room. They undressed slowly, revealing the skin beneath the soot. They were a map of their journey, bruises from the work, scars from the past, lines of fatigue from the day. When they lay down on the bed, it was not with the frantic energy of the storm. It was with a deliberate, heavy grace. Elias moved over her, his weight familiar and welcome. Maggie opened to him, pulling him down. Their lovemaking was a conversation without words. It was the memory of the snowdrift where he found her. It was the heat of the courtroom where she stood for him. It was the terror of the fire and the relief of the rain. Every touch was a claim. "I am here. I am yours." We survived. It was tender and intense, a slow burn that went deeper than bone. It was a radiant victory against the cold, against the judgment, against the odds. When it was over, they lay tangled together, limbs heavy and warm. Elias kissed the damp hair at her temple. "I love you, Maggie Boone," he whispered into the dark. It was the first time he had said the words aloud. Maggie smiled, pressing her face into the curve of his neck. "I love you." Elias. Outside. The Wild West remained harsh. The coyotes howled in the distance. The wind rattled the loose shingles on the roof. The future was unwritten, full of droughts and blizzards and hard years. But inside that small circle of warmth, the light spilled out onto the dark, rugged land. Two people, once broken and judged, had built a fortress that no storm could shatter. They slept, holding on to each other, a small but shining defiance against the vastness of the frontier. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Elias and Maggie as much as I enjoyed telling it. It is a story about the resilience of the human heart and the way love can bloom even in the coldest, hardest places. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel across the plains of the world. If you want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and survival on the American frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. What did you think of the ending? Do you think they made a good home for Caleb? Until next time, keep your fire burning.